The Civil War was fought over power, politics, and principle. But not every battle happened in the open. In the shadows, some men abandoned every rule of honor and turned killing into their only purpose.
It was more of the men who made their own law, or they disregarded the laws that were in place.
Among them was one who terrified soldiers and civilians alike.
When his name was spoken, it means death was coming.
They called him Bloody Bill. He wasn't remembered for leadership or strategy, but for fear itself.
He didn't fight for glory, he fought for fear.
His raids left behind mutilated bodies and burning towns. So who was he, and how did he become the very face of terror? The making of Bloody Bill. William Anderson didn't start out as Bloody Bill. He started out as a kid on a Kentucky farm, born around 1840 in Hopkins County to William and Martha Anderson. He was one of several children in a family that had a decent name, but not much money. Like so many others at that time, they were always chasing a better life. They moved first into Missouri and then farther west to Kansas, settling near Council Grove. That town sat right on the Santa Fe Trail, where freight wagons rumbled through every day. Soldiers marched in lines, and fortune seekers passed by with hope in their eyes. Life there was tough, but it promised opportunity. By 1860, the Andersons had carved out a farm, built up some respect, and made friends among neighbors. They didn't own slaves, but like many who had come from slave states, they saw slavery as part of the natural order of things. That same year, tragedy struck and changed everything. One stormy day, Martha, William's mother, was hit and killed by lightning in the yard. It was sudden, violent, and devastating. For William and his brothers and sisters, Jim, Ellis, Mary Ellen, Josephine, and Martha Jane, it tore out the heart of their family. The move west had promised stability, but instead, they were about to be dragged into the chaos of a border war. Work around Council Grove meant hauling goods and livestock along the Santa Fe Trail. William did his share, and once joined a wagon train headed to New Mexico. But on that trip, wagons, cargo, and animals mysteriously disappeared. On the trail, where lawmen were always days away, rumors like that stuck and reputations shifted fast. Around the same time, his brother Ellis got drunk, killed a native man in a fight, and fled to Iowa. That sort of violence wasn't rare. By 1861, the Civil War had broken out. Prices shot up, soldiers were stretched thin, and patrols were scarce. William and his circle slid from honest hauling into horse theft. Horses meant fast cash. If you stole a string of them, drove them far enough, and sold them in the right place, you could pocket a fortune with no questions asked. Once you knew the trails and the buyers, it was too easy to stop. Then came Judge Arthur Ingham Baker. At first, he was a friendly neighbor. He ran a store, served as postmaster, and got along fine with the Andersons. But Union troops arrested him in 1861 and hauled him off to Fort Scott. When he came back the next spring, trust was gone. Baker accused William of stealing horses. William's father, furious, marched over to confront him with a gun. Baker shot him dead. That killing set off a chain reaction. A few weeks later, William and his brother Jim decided to get revenge. They lured Baker and his new brother-in-law, George Seeger, into the basement of a store near Rock Creek. They barricaded the door and set the place on fire. Seeger died in the flames. Baker was shot and left in the burning rubble. It was July 2nd, 1862, the day William Anderson crossed from outlaw to killer. To understand what came next, you need to see Missouri and Kansas in those years. The land had been bleeding long before the Civil War began. Pro-slavery, border ruffians, and anti-slavery free staters raided each other's towns, torching homes and forcing families to flee. Once the war started, regular soldiers couldn't cover everything, so irregular fighters took over. Pro-Union raiders from Kansas were called Jayhawkers. Pro-Confederate fighters from Missouri were called bushwhackers. Neither side fought fair. Jayhawkers looted farms and burned barns, calling it justice. Bushwhackers hid in the woods, ambushed patrols, and disappeared. Each side claimed the other started it, and each raid was answered with another raid. The Union finally tried to cut off guerrilla support with a brutal order. In August of 1863, General Thomas Ewing signed General Order No. 11. It forced every family out of 4 Missouri counties. Houses were burned, crops destroyed, and whole neighborhoods emptied. People called it the Burnt District. It punished everyone, guilty and innocent alike. For a man like William, living in a land of ashes and ruin, finding reasons to fight was never hard. That same year, William and his brother joined up with William Clark Quantrill, the most feared Confederate guerrilla leader on the border. Quantrill's men lived off the land, hid with friendly families, and struck without warning. William fit right in. He learned quickly, carried multiple revolvers, and soon had his own small group under him. To Union supporters, he was a murderer. To Southern families, he was a shield. But in truth, he was turning into something else entirely, a man who lived off fear. That summer, a tragedy hardened him even more. In Kansas City, Union troops had locked up young women connected to guerrillas in a makeshift jail. On August 13th, the building collapsed. 4 girls were killed, and others were badly injured. Among the dead was William's teenage sister, Josephine. Another sister, Jenny, survived, but was permanently crippled. Rumors spread that Union troops had weakened the building on purpose. Later studies doubted it, but the truth didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what people believed. And in the woods, the men believed it was foul play. For William, losing his sister and believing she'd been killed deliberately was like pouring gasoline on an already burning fire. Just 8 days later, before sunrise, Quantrill's men rode into Lawrence, Kansas. The town was the heart of the anti-slavery cause, and guerrillas blamed it for years of raids into Missouri. The raiders split into squads, stormed homes, shot men and boys, set buildings on fire, and looted. By the time they rode away, between 160 and 190 males lay dead, almost 1/5 of the town's men. In dollars of that time, the damage ran to more than $1 million. Women were widowed, and children were left fatherless. William was there, fighting hard, and he left with a reputation as one of the most brutal men in the band. If there was a moment his name started to spread in fear, it was Lawrence. The Union answered with fury. Families were thrown out of their homes under Order Number 11. The border turned into a wasteland of empty farms and guarded posts, but Quantrill's men kept riding, and William kept climbing. In October of 1863, they struck again at Baxter Springs. Part of the band attacked Fort Blair and failed. Another part, with William among them, ambushed a Union column carrying General James G. Blunt's headquarters. The result was slaughter. Dozens were killed, including Major Henry Z. Curtis, the son of a Union general. Blunt barely made it out alive. This was their way: pick a soft target, hit hard, then vanish before anyone could respond. Winter forced both sides into camp, and Quantrill led his men south into North Texas. But sitting still didn't cool tempers. It made them worse. William accused Quantrill of ordering a Confederate officer's murder. Fights broke out inside the band. Confederate authorities even arrested Quantrill for a short time. By the spring of 1864, the group was breaking apart. William had the nerve and the loyal men to strike out on his own. Confederate officers treated him like a captain, even if he never wore a uniform or cared for rules. From that point on, people started calling him something new: Bloody Bill. The road from Kentucky farm boy to guerrilla captain wasn't fast, but every step made sense in the world he lived in. By the time he broke away from Quantrill, he didn't need a cause anymore. He just needed targets. By early 1864, newspapers and army reports named William Anderson as the man calling the shots for his own riders. These weren't polished soldiers. They were locals who knew the land like the back of their hands. They knew which barns could hide them, which families would deliver a message, which patrols took which roads, and even when the sheriff went to bed. That kind of network didn't need forts. It was built on cousins, friends, and hidden pastures. Once Anderson had his own command, the rules, or whatever was left of them, vanished, and it opened the door to even darker acts that would ultimately lead to his violent end. The fall of Bloody Bill. By the summer of 1864, people in Missouri and Kansas weren't whispering about William Anderson anymore. They were saying his new name out loud because it carried a warning: Bloody Bill. He was no longer just another guerrilla riding under someone else's orders. He was leading his own band now, 70 to 80 riders strong, and they terrified everyone in their path. These weren't soldiers standing in neat rows with muskets. They wore whatever they wanted, often Union bluecoats stripped off the dead, and they didn't bother with one rifle each, like the militias they faced. Instead, they strapped revolvers across their belts and saddles, sometimes carrying as many as 6, so they could fire again and again at close range without stopping to reload. Reports from the time painted gruesome pictures: scalps tied to saddles, bodies carved up, even a silk cord knotted over and over to keep count of men killed. Some of those details came from witnesses, others from stories passed along later, but the message was the same. Anderson and his crew were no longer just fighting battles. They were using terror itself as a weapon. The larger Civil War gave him room to operate. That fall, Confederate General Sterling Price launched a push into Missouri, hoping to shake Union control and maybe even sway the upcoming election. Price needed the guerrillas to smash railroads, grab supplies, and spread fear across the countryside so Union forces would scatter. Anderson fit that role perfectly. Records from the time say Confederate leaders treated him like a captain, even if they never officially wrote his name on the roster. They didn't care how brutal he was, as long as he delivered. And he did. Then came the day that sealed his reputation forever. Centralia, Missouri, September 27, 1864. Anderson and his men rode into the small town at sunrise, stormed the saloons for whiskey, robbed the depot for cash, and then blocked the tracks of the North Missouri Railroad. When a passenger train slowed to a stop, the riders swarmed it. On board were civilians, but also Union soldiers traveling home on leave. Anderson's men dragged the soldiers out, stripped off their uniforms, and lined them up in front of the town. One of them, Sergeant Thomas Goodman, stepped forward, willing to take the bullet he thought was meant for an officer. Instead, Anderson spared him to use later as a bargaining chip and executed the rest. 22 unarmed men shot dead in front of everyone. The depot and the train were torched. Goodman would later escape and publish what he saw, describing it as a nightmare too real to forget. News traveled fast. Just hours later, Major A.V.E. Johnston of the 39th Missouri Mounted Infantry led about 140 men out to hunt Anderson down. They rode borrowed horses and carried long, single-shot, muzzle-loading rifles, the worst kind of weapon for close fighting. When they spotted Anderson's riders and tried to dismount into a line, the guerrillas came at them full speed. Revolvers cracked again and again, wave after wave, at point-blank range. Johnston's men fired once, then the line broke apart. By the end of it, more than 100 Union soldiers were dead. Anderson's band had barely taken losses. What began as a train ambush ended as one of the bloodiest small-unit massacres of the entire war. Centralia was more than just a raid. It froze travel along the railroad, panicked Union commanders across Missouri, and proved that fewer than 100 guerrillas could wreck an entire district in one day. Just the day before, Union troops had burned the town of Rocheport as part of their crackdown on suspected guerrilla supporters. Now, in brutal fashion, Anderson showed what his side could do in return. That back-and-forth cycle of destruction made everything that followed even worse. Inside Anderson's camp, the victory only fueled their swagger. Teenagers rode with him, including Jesse James, who soaked up every lesson. Anderson didn't give long speeches about war. He taught by doing. Ride hard, strike first, get close, fire until your pistols are empty, then vanish before the enemy can regroup. That was his playbook, and it worked. His band grew bolder every week. Union leaders knew they had to stop him. They turned to Lieutenant Colonel Samuel P. Cox, a former scout who understood guerrilla tricks. Cox gathered hardened men who had fought bushwhackers before. His plan wasn't to chase Anderson across the countryside. It was to set a trap and end him for good. But Anderson wasn't slowing down. Even in October, with Price's main forces on the move, Anderson kept raiding. In Glasgow, Missouri, he and his men stormed the home of a wealthy Union supporter, beat him, robbed him, and left a trail of wreckage that locals never forgot. Some accounts from the time even accused Anderson of rape during those raids. True or not, the fear was real, and it spread quickly. Life behind Union lines was becoming unbearable, and Cox was determined to put a stop to it. That chance came on October 26, 1864, near a place called Albany, in Ray County, close to the modern town of Orick. Cox's scouts picked up Anderson's trail, and his men set themselves behind fences and brush, rifles ready. They knew Anderson's style: charge fast, overwhelm, and scatter the enemy. And sure enough, Anderson spotted them and came straight on, expecting the same collapse he had seen at Centralia. But this time, the Union line held steady. Anderson kept pressing forward, even as his men pulled back. Then a shot hit him in the head. He toppled from his horse and hit the dirt. The entire fight lasted only minutes. The aftermath showed just how personal the war had become. Cox's men hauled Anderson's body to Richmond, Missouri. They posed it for photographs, displayed it for the public, and passed his gear around as trophies. Reports say they found a silk cord with knots tied over and over, each knot supposed to mark a kill. Papers pulled from his pockets confirmed who he was. The dates in old reports don't always match perfectly, but the most consistent evidence says he died on October 26th, with paperwork filed the following day. The point is clear. Union commanders wanted this death to be seen, not just recorded. Anderson's death didn't stop the bloodshed in Missouri right away. The war dragged on, but the spell around one man was broken. His band scattered. Some returned to William Clark Quantrill. Some went home. Others, like Archie Clement, kept fighting until they, too, were cut down in gunfights the following year. The teenager Jesse James, who had ridden under Anderson, went on to trade war for robbery, bringing the same fast strike tactics to trains and banks. So why does the name Bloody Bill still hit so hard? It wasn't only the body count at Centralia, terrible as that was. It was the way he turned fear itself into his weapon. He dressed his riders in Union uniforms to get close. He prized speed and shock over battle lines. He relied on pistols instead of rifles so he could fire fast and often. It wasn't the way armies usually fought, but in the woods, hollows, and small towns of Missouri, it worked like a nightmare no one could escape. Even today, historians who debate whether he was a sadist by nature or simply twisted by the brutal border war all agree on one point. He figured out how to make small groups feel like an army. But Anderson wasn't the only name whispered in fear. Just across the border, another figure was carving out his own legend, one every bit as ruthless and just as unforgettable. Champ Ferguson, the other face of terror. Champ Ferguson was the kind of man neighbors whispered about in fear. Folks along the Kentucky-Tennessee border said he could appear out of nowhere, strike, and vanish before you even had time to react. He wasn't a soldier who stood in neat rows or followed marching orders. He fought on his own terms, settled his own grudges, and lived by a code only he seemed to understand. Crossing him meant you might not live to see the sunrise. His full name was Samuel Champ Ferguson. He was born on November 29, 1821, in Clinton County, Kentucky, right along the state line. He was the oldest of 10 children, growing up in the rugged hills, where farming, trading, and family ties meant everything. By the time he was in his late 20s, Champ had gained a reputation for a quick temper, and he owned a handful of enslaved people. Not unusual for the region, but something that marked him as a man with more means than most. Life there wasn't easy. The land was tough, the roads were little more than dirt tracks, and families were split between Union and Confederate loyalties. Political debates often ended with fists, knives, or worse. Trouble had already wrapped itself around Champ before the Civil War ever started. In August of 1858, he fought with two men known as the Evans brothers. When a constable named James Reed tried to break it up, Champ killed him. One of the Evans brothers barely survived brutal stab wounds. That clash put Champ firmly on the wrong side of the law and stoked a feud that would burn for years. Soon after, he moved with his wife and children down to the Calfkiller River Valley in White County, Tennessee. But moving counties didn't end the grudges, they just followed him. When war broke out in 1861, men like Champ formed their own bands, fighting outside any official structure. Champ quickly became one of the most feared of these fighters. Sometimes he linked up with bigger Confederate names like John Hunt Morgan or Joe Wheeler. From the very beginning, it was personal. His enemies weren't nameless soldiers. They were men he already knew, Union-leaning farmers, deputies, small-town officials, and neighbors who had crossed him. On November 1st, 1861, he rode to the home of William Frog in Clinton County. Frog's wife, Esther, later told a court that Champ shot her husband right in front of her and rode off. A few weeks later, he and one of his riders lured Reuben Wood out near his house, exchanged a few words, and killed him on the spot. The pattern was terrifying. Show up where a man lived, pull him outside, and leave him dead in his own yard. The killings stacked up. On Sunday, June 1st, 1862, Elijah Coger stepped out to fetch water from the spring by his home. Champ Ferguson and his riders were waiting. Shots cracked from the edge of his yard. He tried to run but was cut down, hit so many times that neighbors later counted more than 30 wounds. Fear spread across the region. Men stopped sleeping in their own homes. Families kept watch at night. Dogs barked endlessly. Everyone knew Ferguson's riders might appear at any moment. That October, on the 28th, Champ confronted Washington Wash Tabor near Albany, Kentucky. Witnesses later said Tabor begged for his life, but Champ shot him in the body. When someone in his group urged him to finish the job, he pressed the pistol to Tabor's head and pulled the trigger. It wasn't a battle. It was a warning for anyone who thought they could cross him and live. The feud spilled into the next year. On New Year's Day, 1863, Champ Ferguson and his riders stormed a house in Russell County, where Union men had gathered. From upstairs, they opened fire. Private Elam Huddleston was shot and fell from the upper floor. Ferguson's men shot Peter Zachary dead and killed his relative Allen in the same raid. People in the area didn't need newspapers to hear about it. News spread in churchyards, at sawmills, and at country stores. The message was always the same: stay off Champ Ferguson's bad side. He wasn't just killing close to home. He rode with Confederate raiders when it suited him, and even scouted for John Hunt Morgan during his Kentucky raids. But Champ always returned to running his own show. Confederate officers weren't blind to the way he operated. In Wytheville, Virginia, they even jailed him for 2 months on a murder charge tied to a Confederate official. The case collapsed, and before long, he was free and back in the saddle. On the Union side, there was a man who mirrored him, David Tinker Dave Beatty. He was another guerrilla, every bit as ruthless, and the two men spent years hunting each other. Their bands fought across creeks and farms, each side blaming the other for every outrage. Neither gave mercy. Their feud didn't stop until one of them was in the ground. But the day that sealed Champ Ferguson's reputation came far from Kentucky. In October of 1864, Union forces launched an attack on the salt works at Saltville, Virginia. Salt was essential to both armies. Without it, meat rotted and soldiers went hungry. After the battle, hundreds of wounded Union men, including many from the 5th United States Colored Cavalry, made up of black troops led by white officers, were scattered across the battlefield and crammed into a makeshift hospital at Emory and Henry College. That's where Champ appeared. On October 8th, witnesses said Champ and his men stormed into the hospital armed with pistols. Among the wounded was Lieutenant Elza C. Smith, a white officer from Kentucky who had spent much of the war chasing guerrillas. Survivors later testified that Smith recognized him and pleaded, "Champ, for God's sake, don't shoot me here." But Champ pulled the trigger. The bullet tore through Smith's head. Other witnesses said they saw black soldiers dragged from their beds and killed. One of Champ's riders was heard telling him, "Make sure the work is done right." Doctors and even Confederate officers tried to intervene, but guards claimed they were under Captain Ferguson's orders. The testimony stuck because so many men in that hospital lived to tell the story later. By the spring of 1865, when the war ended, Champ Ferguson had become the face of everything ugly about the border war. He himself admitted he had killed more than 100 men. Some said the number was less, some claimed more, but the exact total didn't matter. The Union didn't need a perfect list. After the Confederacy collapsed, soldiers found him back on his farm, arrested him, and hauled him to Nashville for trial. The indictment named 53 murders. Some were soldiers, some were civilians. Several were tied to the hospital killings in Virginia. His trial became a public spectacle. The courtroom was packed. Newspapers carried the details, and his old enemy, Tinker Dave Beatty, testified against him. One by one, witnesses stood up and told their stories. Esther Frog described watching her husband being shot in their yard. Neighbors spoke of Reuben Wood being lured out and executed. Others described Elijah Coger, riddled with bullets by his spring. Doctors and nurses from Emory and Henry told the jury about Lieutenant Smith's final words, begging not to be shot in a hospital bed, and the pistol shot that ended him anyway. Even a Confederate quartermaster confirmed Champ's presence that day. That single moment, a wounded officer begging for mercy and being shot anyway, became the centerpiece of the trial. Champ didn't deny everything. He admitted to certain killings, even acknowledged shooting Smith, but he insisted some of the men had died in fights, not murders. He tried to excuse Smith's death as payback for a Confederate friend named Captain Hamilton, whom he claimed Smith had mistreated. But the jury didn't buy it. In October of 1865, the verdict was read, guilty. The sentence was death by hanging. On October 20th, 1865, in the yard of the Tennessee State Penitentiary in Nashville, Champ Ferguson walked to the gallows. Before the noose went around his neck, he gave one final statement. "I die a rebel out and out," he declared, and asked to be buried back in White County. He was 43 years old. People who had lost brothers, fathers, and sons to his band stood in the crowd and watched as he dropped. His body was later carried home and buried in a comb grave just north of Sparta. Unlike almost every other guerrilla, Champ Ferguson was held accountable. Out of thousands of irregular fighters who raided farms, ambushed patrols, and murdered neighbors, only 2 men were executed for war crimes. One was Henry Wirtz, the commander of Andersonville Prison. The other was Champ Ferguson. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.